Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about adding and subtracting radical expressions. So to add or subtract radical expressions, you use the associative and distributive properties to simplify the expressions. If the radical expressions are not in simplified form, you simplify them. A radical expression is rational if, when its simplest form, it can be expressed as a quotient of two integers. If a radical expression in simplest form still contains a radical, the expression is irrational. So what we need to remember is that in order to add or subtract, we need to have like terms. So if you recall, we learned that 6x minus 3x is 3x because once they have the same term, we just add their coefficients. So 6 and negative 3 equals 3x. So we're going to do the same thing here. So when I look at this radical expression, first thing I'm going to do is make sure all my radicals are simplified. So in this case, they are all simplified. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group like terms. So my like terms are 10 radical 6 minus 4 radical 6. And those are like terms because they have the same radicand. Radicand is the number underneath. And then, pushed the wrong button. Plus negative 5 radical 3 plus 6 radical 3. Because those are like terms because they have the same radical. So I add my coefficients. So 10 and negative 4 is 6 radical 6. Then again, I add my coefficients. Negative 5 plus 6 is plus radical 3. That is now simplified. That is now irrational because when it's simplified, I still have radicals. So that means that those are not perfect squares, so it's simplified. So example 2. First thing I need to do is I need to look. Is radical 12 in simplest radical form? It is not, because radical 12 has a perfect square factor of 4. So the first thing I'm going to do is simplify that. So that's 5 radical 4 radical 3 minus, now again I need to look at 75. Is 75 radical 75 in simplest radical form? It is not, because it has a perfect square factor of 25. So there's 2 radical 25 radical 3. Square root of 4 is 2, so that's 5 times 2 radical 3. Minus square root of 25 is 5, so that's 2 times 5 radical 3. So 5 times 2 is 10, so this is 10 radical 3 minus 10 radical 3. Which that equals 0. So the expression is rational because when simplified it equals 0, and 0 is a rational number. It's actually a whole number. So now we're going to try some more examples. So when I look at number 1, these are already simplified because they're both radical 5. So 2 plus 4 is 6 radical 5, which is irrational. Number 2, they're both simplified. So it's 1, because that's the coefficient of radical 6. There's a 1 there. So that's negative 3 radical 6. So that's also irrational. Number 3, I need to simplify radical 8, which radical 8 has a perfect square factor of 4. So that's radical 4 radical 2 minus radical 2. Radical 4 is 2 radical 2 minus radical 2, which equals radical 2. So that's irrational. Remember, when we're adding or subtracting, we treat the radicals as though they're x's or y's. So I want you to pause, and I want you to try 4, 5, and 6 and come back and check. Okay, so number 4, first thing I did is I simplified radical 75. Radical 75 is radical 25 times radical 3. Square root of 25 is 5, so 5 times 3 gives me 15, and then the radical 3 plus 2 radical 5. That is my final answer because radical 3 and radical 5 are not like terms. So that's my final answer, and it's irrational. Number 5, again, first thing I do is I simplify. Radical 20 becomes radical 4 radical 5, which is 2 radical 5. Radical 50 is radical 25 times radical 2, which is 5 radical 2. Radical 45 becomes radical 9 times radical 5, which is 3 radical 5. The like terms are 2 radical 5 and negative 3 radical 5, so I add those together, which gives me negative 1 radical 5 plus 5 radical 2. So that is my final answer, which is irrational. Number 6, again, I simplify. Radical 12 is radical 4 radical 3, which is 2 radical 3, plus radical 6. I simplify radical 75, which is radical 25 radical 3, which is minus 5 radical 3. Combine like terms, which is 2 radical 3 and negative 5 radical 3, which gives me negative 3 radical 3 plus radical 6, which is also irrational. So finally, I want you to pause and try the last 4 and come back and check. So again, I simplified everything first. I then combined like terms. So number 7 is 5 radical 2, which is irrational. Number 8, I simplified everything first, combined like terms, which is 5 radical 6 minus 2 radical 2, which is irrational. 9, again, I simplify everything first. Even though there's sorry about the bell. Even though there's an A, I still all the same, so I just combine like terms, which is 16 radical 2A, which is irrational, and number 10 is 5 radical 6, which is irrational. If you have any questions, please ask during class.